Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend, Publish, and Lead, and welcome to episode 115, Responding to a Call for Proposals. Calls for proposals vary differently from discipline to discipline, but in my discipline of writing studies, these tend to come in a couple of different ways. Some of these come just via email list procs where there's an announcement for a yearly conference, so submissions for a conference in that way. We do a lot of edited collections and calls for book chapters in my discipline of writing studies. So sometimes you'll get these on list procs, other times you'll hear about them through friends. You might see them in the back of a scholarly journal. And I had a client ask me about how to respond to one when one comes along. And the question was couched in the idea of, okay, you're in the middle of doing your regular writing projects you've planned out for the semester, and then all of a sudden a call for papers comes along. It's one that you want to do, and it has an upcoming deadline. What happens? So this is kind of along the lines of an episode I did a couple of weeks back on responding to a revise and resubmit. A lot of times when we submit articles for publication or projects for publications, we only have a couple of weeks to turn them back around to respond to something like that. And because that's a publication, or I should say a project that's closer to publication, my advice generally is just to drop whatever it is you're currently working on, get that thing out the door that has to be revised and resubmitted, and move on. And so for calls for papers, I'm going to present a couple of similar pieces of advice and also show a real live time that this happened to me, because it's actually just happened to me a day or two ago. And I thought it would be useful just to see some differences between those two things. Because a revise and resubmit, that might take you some time. That might take you 2 full weeks every writing session you have. For calls for papers, I tend to lean towards more picking calls for papers or picking projects that I'm actually interested in submitting to, but they're also a good match with my interests. And as soon as the call comes out, I know right away what I would be pitching to them. So sometimes calls for papers for yearly conferences, that's a different story. That's something I'll tackle in another podcast about capturing your ideas. But something like a call for papers for a special journal issue or something that's on your topic, that's something that sometimes can be knocked out a little bit more quickly. So in this episode, I'm just going to share a couple of quick slides, and I'll describe for audio-only listeners what are some things that I did to knock out a call for papers. Because one of the things I did was, once I saw one that came along, I had been thinking about this conversation with a client in my head about how do you manage that with your other writing projects. So for this project, I actually took some screenshots and timed myself so I could figure out, well, how did I do that? So this one, and I will go ahead and click to it, is the call for papers that I responded to is a call for an edited collection on, it's called There Are Writing Emergencies, and it talks about just how do we, work as writers, teachers of writing, writing program administrators in a time of crisis. So that's a topic that certainly, like those of you that are in our health professions that listen to us, or sciences, that's not a topic that maybe is one that you would submit to. But for me, I was like, oh, well, writing emergencies, that's something we deal with every single day at Defend, Publish, and Lead. That's not the number one reason people come to us, but I would say it's definitely 2 or 3. So I knew when I saw this call for an edited collection that would be an angle that I would like to talk about. So one of my first pieces of advice for those of you that see a call for papers come along as you're working on something else would just be to decide, do I have a project for this right now? Could I start writing on something immediately when I'm looking at this call? Because I do think that some of us will decide, well, that's a collection I should probably put something in for, or I need a publication, so I'm going to put in a chapter proposal. But then what happens is maybe you picked a project that isn't a great match, or once it comes along and you get accepted, you don't really want to do the project. I've had that happen a long time ago when I was a tenure track faculty. I felt like any publication opportunity that came along, I should do it. And I know that there was one project like that for a special journal issue that I really didn't want to do it, but I was like, I need a publication. And sometimes, to be fair, you do need a publication. So you do need to respond to something like that. But in general, for something that's a call for papers that's more on a special topic, like a special journal issue, an edited collection, for something like that, I always think it's good to just decide, do I actually have a project that fits in this, or do I have to make something? So the other consideration for me is, yes, I will need to write this chapter. I haven't written this yet. I haven't even thought about this idea until I saw this call for papers. But could I make this content relatively quickly? Because I know some things that I would say. I know some places to look for resources. I'm already thinking ahead when we do project management at Defend, Publish, and Lead. I try to advise clients to think ahead to what is it going to take for me to execute this when they need it. So in this call for papers, there's a deadline for when full chapters are due. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I think it was sometime in the summer. I also thought ahead as to, could I complete, if they say yes, could I complete this project in the time that they are asking? And I know for me, I could do that. I've just come off of completing a larger book project. Right now, as I had mentioned on another podcast about mapping my writing to the semester, I also just got finished knocking out 2 presentations. So I had this book revision, I had these 2 presentations. And so the other major project I have this semester that I am working on is our website content. So I know, yes, of course, I want to get our website done and I want to get it up because I'm really excited about the look of it. And for those of you watching this on YouTube, you can see, we even have our new design on our slides for our YouTube content. So I know that that's important, but I'm also thinking with a call for papers, can I complete this task in the time that they are asking? So if I'm already overloaded with projects, here's another thing that will come into consideration for me. If I'm already overloaded, or I know if I add this one other thing, is everything going to get crazy? Right now, this is a good time for this to come along because I know I could pull it off. If it would have come along last year at this time, I probably would not have responded, even though I would have liked to. Even if I love the topic, I would have not done it. Another thing to think about when we're thinking about project mix and calls for papers is these represent writing opportunities. So if I'm going to do this writing opportunity, you also have to think about what's the payoff. And I think the payoff is, and for me, for this particular project, I like the 2 editors. I think they both do great work. I'm interested in the topic, and it's got a lot of room to be a really interesting collection. So for me, I'm just interested in the project, period. But I also know that at my institution, chapters for edited collection count towards tenure. I don't need that at this moment, but for any kind of future promotion, if we would go to, post-tenure review at my institution, I am thinking ahead that would this check a box that I have another publication? Yes, it would. At your institution, some of these projects might not count in the same way. So I just counseled somebody that asked us about tenure track requirements for publication, and their institution was fairly clear that special journal issues and edited collections count less than a straight up peer-reviewed scholarly journal article. That might be another consideration to take into account. So what I ended up doing with this calls for papers is I mentioned early at this podcast that I like to get the call and then sort of knock it out the day that I decide I'm going to do it. I can't always pull that off, but I sort of like a 24-hour turnaround to get rid of it, because usually what you have to propose is not very long. In this case, it was 500 words, so it was not a very long call. So what I did, and what I always do when I look at these, is decide what is my entry point. And what I mean by that is, how am I going to get into this conversation about writing emergencies? So when I read this call for proposal, I looked for a couple of things. And what I'm looking for me is, what are some things I think are really interesting that I would want to write about? So one of the things that I really liked in this particular call is it basically said, this is a volume of scholarship and a toolkit of strategies. And that toolkit of strategies really, that was the first thing that I noticed when I read it. I'm like, oh, well, we have a toolkit of strategies at Defend, Publish, and Lead, and we use these all the time to help writing clients. So that was one. But then the other spot was, usually in these calls for journal issues or edited collections, they have either some questions, or they tip the writer off as to some things that they want. So what are some things they're hoping the collection will accomplish? I checked out the spot where it talked about some different from the writer's angle, what are some ways that writers can navigate challenges? And then I thought about where I would come in as somebody that's actually facilitating these writers navigating challenges. So on screen, what's showing is just a couple things highlighted and a little arrow on the call for those things that I just picked out that I'm interested in. So one of the other things that I do when I read a call for papers is I read it once through and then I read it through a second time for what is it that I think will be my entry point. So there's no way, obviously, with these calls for papers, you can address everything or try to tick every box. And I know that we work with a lot of new clients that try to do that. So when they respond to a call for papers, they try to make sure, like a job application, that they could check as many of the pieces off as possible. But I would argue that a lot of edited collections are looking for a good mix of submissions that are doing lots of different things. So yours doesn't have to check every box. I think it would be more important to think about what unique angle can you bring. And in this case, for mine, I think we could bring the unique angle of writing coaching outside of higher education or outside of an institution of higher education. So that was going to be my entry point. And so what I ended up doing was I like to kind of bang out a first draft in response with like a, kind of a, I don't want to call it a throwaway title, but sort of a fake title. So in my title, I thought about triage and how, that's something that's used in like an emergency room, and I worked from there. But, what's showing on screen is my first draft that I banged out in 45 minutes. I did do, a little bit of cleanup of like typos and stuff on the way. I did not get all of them, as those of you on the YouTube can see. There's still some of those in there. But one of the things I also try to do when I write these calls for papers in something that's like a 500-word document, I like to think of it in chunks. So I have something where I give just a very brief little literature review, not a literature review, but a little background on my particular chunk. So one of the things that I did in there was basically point out that we haven't really heard from writing coaching companies owned by writing studies faculty. That's something we just haven't considered in my discipline. So I pulled that out. I also said that, we have a lot of writing emergencies at Defend, Publish, and Lead, which we do. And then talked about why these, how we have a set of behaviors or a set of triage behaviors that we use to address these situations. So if you're a client that's in crisis and you come to us, there's a decision-making process. So we'll have some clients that will say, I am about to get kicked out of my graduate program if I don't finish my dissertation this semester. That's a crisis. But then we'll also have faculty members that will say, I have to turn in my tenure narratives in 48 hours. Can someone look these over and, give me some help on these issues? We also have provosts and deans and people with crises in that way where they have to respond to something in writing. Since our services are confidential, they will come to us and say, I have to respond to this student issue. Do you have some feedback on how this might be approached in a very rhetorically savvy way? So I knew that was something cool that I could write about. So I just kind of banged out a first draft. That was what I used my writing session for. So my other writing that was supposed to be happening that day just got pushed back a day. And then I also made sure in my proposal that I listed out what my chapter does or what it accomplishes or what it offers the reader. I like to do that in every call for papers that I respond to, whether it's a special journal issue or not, but just to say, like, the way I set it up here was specifically this chapter does 4 things. And then I said what those 4 things are. I just know as somebody who has edited a special journal and edited a collection twice now, I like to know what is the takeaway for the reader. So if you're somebody that's working on a call or responding to a call for papers, that might be some good feedback there. And then a second one that I had was a 20-minute draft. And what was awesome about this, there's actually a typo on our slides for it. And I left it in because I was writing the call for papers and I was doing the slides for the YouTube at the same time. So I left it in just so you could kind of see that this was all happening in very quick order. But this was a 20-minute revision where I kind of went through and said, okay, what am I missing out of that call for papers that still isn't in there? And so one of the things that I did was talking about how writing crises are determined to be crises in Defend, Publish, and Lead, because that was something that I know wasn't in there. So again, I took a second draft look through. I looked at the call for papers again to see. And then it took me about 32 minutes to get it cleaned up for a final submission. This did not require going through anything difficult. It was a Google form to submit it. So all I needed was some kind of a draft. My draft is actually longer than 500 words, but because I could see that it was a Google form, I didn't worry too much about trying to get down to 500. I think I ended up somewhere around like 580 or something like that. But yeah, I just cleaned it up. I have a picture on screen in YouTube what the full thing looks like. I have my bulleted list about the 4 things the chapter accomplishes. But then I totaled up how much time it took me to do this whole response, and it was about 1 hour and 37 minutes. So since I've been trying to do 2 hours of writing on weekday mornings. I try to do that 5 days a week. So somewhere between 8 and 10 hours is a successful writing week for me. So for me, does this mean I lost one of my writing session days? Pretty much. I had 20 minutes left to get something done. And in that case, what I used that last 20 minutes for was just to sort of juggle things around because I lost 1 day of working on some writing content for the website. So I'm hoping that this helps you think through how you might respond to a call for papers if one comes along. I also want to point out, switching over to our textbook and academic authors resource of the day, I want to switch to a topic in there. This isn't about a call for papers, but some of the strategies would be the same because sometimes the opportunities will come along for us to apply for grants. And in my mind, the same rules apply. If it's a deadline that's coming up, you want that grant, sometimes you have to put those other things aside to do it. So what's showing on screen right now for those of you on the audio only is just that Textbook and Academic Authors Association offers academic and textbook writing grants. It's under the resources tab if you belong to that organization. If you don't, check our show notes. We've got a discount code in there. But what you can do is you can actually get grants to help your projects get published. So you can actually do that. You can also have somebody to look, if you want to have your contract for a textbook reviewed, you can actually get a grant to have somebody look at it from a legal perspective, which is something I didn't even know existed, but something that's really fabulous. So if you are interested in doing this at all, just while we're talking about deadlines, the grant application for TAA is on April 30th. If you have a project coming up that you might need something like a publication grant or a contract review grant. So this resource really is great. The organization is great. If you want to find out more about them, you can see our show notes or just check them out. But we do have a discount code that's in our show notes for this episode, both on YouTube and in the audio version. The other thing that I want to mention as we close out today is if you haven't seen this, every month we do Defend, Publish, and Lead writing classes. And these are 1-hour writing classes where you actually learn a technique or a tool for writing and you actually do writing in the class. So it's one way. Yes, it counts for one of your writing session hours if you want to do that. But if you're interested in joining us, our next one is coming up on March 22nd at 12 noon Eastern. You can also get the recording if that's not a time that you're available. And at the moment, these classes are running at $25 each. So it's kind of a great 1-hour, really focused writing session. The topic for March is writing scholarly paragraphs. And in that session, we're going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of making scholarly paragraphs in our work, but also developing some from scratch and revising some in current work. So if you're interested in joining us, that event is on Eventbrite. Just look for Defend and Publish on Eventbrite. We're still listed as Defend and Publish there. And I hope you have a good week. Happy writing, everyone.